Hi and welcome to my OCR A-Level Biology revision session with me, Christine. So today's lesson I want to look at evolution and phylogeny. So what is evolution then? Evolution is the cumulative changes that are inherited within a population. So we know that the organisms within a population are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So when they interbreed, what they do is they pass on their alleles. Those alleles are then expressed, and what we see is their phenotype. Well, evolution is where we see this cumulative change in these heritable characteristics of a population. And it depends what these characteristics are, why they're necessary, what is it that gives them advantage, which results in changes continuing and progressing forward. So evolution then is this cumulative change, but how do we know this? Where is the evidence from that? So we tend to look back at fossils. Now, if you think back to GCSE, you'll remember that fossils are the remains of organisms that have been preserved in rock over thousands of years. So if we look at the sequences of fossils, they can actually show us the gradual changes of an organism over geological time. Now, if we think about that, then we need to understand that not all of the fossils are still remaining. Our fossil record is not complete. Any fossils that have been produced, many of those have actually been destroyed through volcanic eruptions, through earthquakes, through plate tectonics. So actually some of those evidence, those fossils that were present have actually been destroyed, that we can't find those missing pieces. Other parts of it are the fact that some of the conditions were not right. So if the conditions weren't right to preserve the organism in the rocks, if the organism decayed too quickly or they were soft-bodied, then we don't have that evidence to look at. But what we try to do is we try to piece together the evolutionary relationships of organisms, and we call that phylogeny. So phylogeny is the name given to this evolutionary relationship between organisms, and it's the basis of classification. So why is it that we put the same groups in together when we classify them? So remember, going back to classification: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. If we organize organisms into their groups, into their taxons, if we put them to the same place, in the same group, are they in the same genus, for example? Are they homos, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo sapiens? If we've grouped them all within the same genus, the generic name of Homo, they have to have a shared common ancestor. Now, we tend to represent that in a phylogenetic tree. So this is my phylogenetic tree, where you can see a lot of different organisms which have been grouped together. That means that they share common ancestors. And those branches actually show where these different species have evolved from a common ancestor. So if we look at the bottom of the tree, just like in a tree where the roots are, this is the common ancestor to all the organisms within this phylogenetic tree. As we move up, every time there is a point where there is a branching off, that is a common ancestor of all the descendants within those branches. So the common ancestor to all the organisms within the tree are at the bottom, but every branching off point, that is the last known common ancestor of the descendants from each of the branches moving up. So it's important that we understand this evolutionary relationship. And we tend to use the different versions of classification to work that out. So one method of classification is looking at anatomical evidence. So this is where we're looking at the structure and functions of different body parts. And one of the most important ones we tend to use are called homologous structures. So the pentadactyl limb is a homologous structure. It is similar in shape. Pentadactyl means there are 5 digits. They are found in different types of organisms All of them have the same bone structure, the pentadactyl limb. However, they are used in different ways. And because they're used in different ways, they're similar in shape, i.e. you have your humerus, your radius, your ulna, and then your carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. However, they are formed differently depending on how they are used. The bat obviously uses it for flying, the dolphin for swimming, the anteater for tearing, the monkey for grasping, and the pig for walking. So these pentadactyl limbs are used in different ways, but have exactly the same anatomical structure. So very similar in shapes because they have the same bone structure. The more similar the homologous structures are between the two species, the more closely related they are likely to be. That is known as adaptive radiation. So when we look at the anatomical evidence of ways of classifying organisms, we're looking at these similar in shape structures, these homologous structures, pentadactyl limb, and then we can work out how closely related organisms are based on that. Obviously, the homologous structures are similar because of that common ancestry. This is an example of that divergent evolution. So where we saw it in our phylogenetic tree before, where you have the common ancestor and then that branching off, that is known as divergent evolution. They share a common ancestor. So that common ancestor will have started with the pentadactyl limb, and then as it progressed through, as evolution occurred, this cumulative changes, the pentadactyl limb will have changed depending on how it was going to be used. So let's look then at the bat and a bird. They have similar structures. They have wings that are used. However, they are not within the same classification, the same evolutionary tree, because a bat is a mammal and a bird is a bird. So this is what's known as analogous characteristics. So the analogous characteristics are that they are similar. So they are both used for flying. However, they actually evolved because of a convergent evolution. So convergent evolution is the fact that they are similar structures, therefore providing similar functions, but they evolved independently due to their niches, and a niche is the habitat and lifestyle that they have. The bat needed to fly, the birds fly. So they evolved independently. It wasn't that they evolved from a common ancestor, because they don't have the same homologous structures. This is therefore called analogous characteristics. So evolution can show us this cumulative change that occurs in the characteristics, but it allows us to be able to classify based on that sharing of that common ancestor. So we can look at the anatomical evidence, or we can look at embryological evidence. So we can look at the early stages of an organism's development and use that to guide whether they should be classified within the same group or whether they should be within different groups. And the more we discover, the more we are able to reclassify organisms. We can also look at behavioral evidence. So behavioral evidence of how do they behave. For example, do they have a specific mating process? How is their social organization of these organisms? What do they do? And we use that as a method of this classification. But the one that's the really important one that we look at now, as we have progressed with our technology, with our advancement in science, what we now do is we look at the molecular evidence. So you'll learn more about DNA sequencing in module 6. But right now, what I want to talk about is just the key part. Our DNA sequence, we're talking about the base sequence of our nitrogenous bases. The sequence that they come in determines the amino acid sequence, which determines the protein. So the DNA base sequence for humans and chimpanzees is about 94% the same. Therefore, what we can say is there have been very few mutations occurred within the DNA sequence of the chimpanzee and the human. there have been mutations which have resulted in changes, which have resulted in evolution from that common ancestor. But what we can say is that these species only diverged relatively recently. And when I say relatively recently, I'm not saying obviously yesterday or a couple of weeks ago. When we talk about the geological time, when we talk about the time frame, if we were looking at a 24-hour clock, we're in a very small, before even a minute in time, when it comes to the time frame of how long ago we diverged from a common ancestor that also resulted in chimpanzees. So it's important to note that divergence from a common ancestor is where there have been changes that have occurred, but we share a common ancestor. So another thing we can look at is protein sequencing. So obviously DNA sequencing, our DNA-based sequence, determines our amino acid sequence. The amino acid sequence therefore gives us what our protein sequence is. So if we were to look at the molecular evidence of the proteins that are produced by the organism, we'd be looking at that amino acid sequence. And one that we tend to look at is cytochrome C, that you'll learn about as a protein used in respiration. Or we can also look at hemoglobin, the protein used for oxygen transport. So if you look here at my example in my table, here is the different species and the number of amino acids that differ from the human beta polypeptide of hemoglobin. So the beta polypeptide of hemoglobin is 146 amino acids in length. Now, gorillas have one amino acid that is different to the human beta polypeptide. The rhesus monkey has 8, the dog has 15, and we can all go all the way down to the sea slug, which is 127. So what we can see here is that the more differences there are within the amino acid sequence, that would therefore determine that there'll be more mutations within that DNA sequence. So this sequence difference, this accumulation of these sequence differences, is gradually showing us a positive correlation between the number of differences between two species and the time since they diverged from a common ancestor. So the fact that all of these organisms, these species, have a polypeptide of hemoglobin, what we can see is those differences mean that they have diverged from a common ancestor. So the sea slug diverged a lot longer ago than the gorilla did. So I hope you like this video, and if you do, then please do click on the like button and subscribe to my channel. Also check out my revision platform www.aiqchat.com to help you revise.